There are a few things in life that'll make a man spit his coffee, choke on his eggs, and nearly trip over a goat in his bathrobe. Finding a brand new public electric vehicle charging station installed in the middle of your front yard is one of them. It had blinking blue lights, a freshly poured concrete slab, and a Property of Meadow Falls HOA sign hammered into the dirt. My dirt. Right where my granddad used to plant tomatoes. I stood there in my socks, staring at it like it was an alien probe. And when I followed the thick black cables running under my grass to the barn's side breaker panel, the same panel I'd rewired myself 20 years ago, something in my chest ticked like a bad fuse. Because I knew that charger wasn't just sitting on my land. It was eating off my meter like a drunk cousin at Thanksgiving. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who likes to yell. I like my mornings quiet, my coffee strong, and my electricity bill predictable. But this morning, I could already hear the faint sound of HOA nonsense buzzing like a mosquito in my ear. And wouldn't you know it, right on cue, Nancy Whitaker, president of the Meadow Falls HOA, came waddling up the path like she owned the place. Nancy's one of those people who says, "we" when she means "you" and smiles while telling you how much better everything will be once you follow her rules. She was wearing a sun hat the size of a satellite dish and sipping some green swamp water from a mason jar like she'd just come from a yoga commune. "Oh good, you're up," she chirped. "Isn't it just beautiful? We installed it last night, community upgrade. This is going to raise all our property values." I stared at her. Then I looked at the charger. Then back at her. "Nancy," I said, "you installed a $30,000 public charging station in the middle of my front yard without asking, and you think I'm gonna thank you?" Her smile twitched. "Well, technically the corner of your lot falls within the HOA's improvement zone, according to the modernization map we passed in last quarter's meeting." "I wasn't at that meeting." "You didn't RSVP." "I've never RSVP'd. I've never even been part of your HOA." "Well," she said, tapping her iPad like it was a holy book, "that's a matter of interpretation. Our new bylaws state that all properties within the visual domain of the community entryway signage are under implied HOA participation. And yours is right there." "Visual domain? It's a legal term." "No, Nancy. It's a made-up term." She chuckled like I was a toddler trying to understand taxes. "Don't worry, Dale. The installation's fully covered by HOA funds. It won't cost you a dime." The words hit me right in the electric bill. "Nancy, is that thing hooked up to my barn power?" She blinked, then gave me the kind of look you give a confused puppy. "Well, we had to connect it to something, didn't we? You've got that old breaker box just sitting there. Richie said it'd be the cleanest hookup." I wanted to scream. Instead, I inhaled through my nose, exhaled through clenched teeth, and walked over to the side of the barn. Sure enough, my old fuse box had a shiny new conduit snaking out of it, duct-taped in places, sloppily sealed in others. Richie must have done it. The HOA's unofficial electrician/spark hazard. Man couldn't wire a toaster without frying a breaker. I turned back to Nancy. "Let me get this straight. Your HOA snuck onto my property in the middle of the night, dug a trench through my yard, hardwired a charger into my power, and now expects me to foot the bill so strangers can juice up their cars for free?" She pursed her lips like she'd tasted sour yogurt. "You make it sound so negative. It's a shared resource. So is oxygen, but I don't let you breathe mine off a meter." She muttered something about old mines and new infrastructure, and walked off, probably to go ruin someone else's morning. I stood there for a long while after she left, just staring at the charger. A black Tesla rolled up not 10 minutes later, plugged in, and the lights on the box started flashing like a Vegas slot machine. I heard the hum of electricity drawing straight from my panel. I imagined the number on my meter ticking up like a jackpot, except I wasn't winning anything. That night, my daughter Lena arrived unannounced, goats in the back of her SUV, and a sleeping bag over her shoulder. "Troy cheated on me with his CrossFit coach," she said by way of greeting, "so I'm staying here a while. Don't ask questions. I didn't. She moved into the loft, the goats took over the shed, and we sat on the porch drinking bourbon and watching the EV charger blink like an eyesore from the future. Why don't you just unplug it? She asked. Too obvious. HOA will just plug it back in. You could sabotage it. They'd sue me. She sipped. Then she smirked. You could repurpose it. I raised an eyebrow. Repurpose? You ever think about upgrading your fence? The goats bleated at that exact moment like they were in on the joke. Next morning, I was up before dawn. Spent 4 hours tracing every cable, measuring resistance, checking load capacity. That old lineman brain of mine started whirring. I knew how to reroute a system without setting off alarms. If they wanted to steal my power, fine, I'd give it to them. Just not in the way they expected. By noon, the EV charger looked the same on the outside, but inside? It was no longer connected to their charger box. It was now juicing a hidden subline that snaked beneath my driveway and straight into the high-tension wire of my pasture fence. I hadn't used that fence in years, not since the cattle days, but today it came alive. A squirrel touched the top rail and went airborne like a popcorn kernel. The charger still blinked politely, but no power flowed to it. It had become a decoy, an expensive, HOA-funded battery disguised as progress. Later that evening, another Tesla rolled up. The driver plugged in, waited 10 minutes, scratched his head, and drove off. The fence, meanwhile, hummed like a sleeping dragon. I leaned back in my rocker, sipped my bourbon, and grinned at Lena. Dad, she said, raising her glass, you just weaponized green energy. No, I said, tipping my hat toward the humming field. I reclaimed it. By the time the third Tesla rolled up to that charger and drove off confused, I was already 3 steps ahead of the HOA. The wiring was flawless, buried deep enough not even Richie's shovel-happy approach would find it unless he brought ground-penetrating radar. I'd routed the power from the public charger directly into the pasture fence, and even added a few regulators to avoid frying the local wildlife. The result was a beautiful hum, a soft, steady vibration of deterrence that ran from post to post. And boy, did it work. A couple of raccoons tested it the first night. One touched a wire, and let out a sound like a car alarm before flipping backward into a patch of dandelions. I swear the goats clapped. Lena filmed the whole thing and posted it online with the caption, Squirrel Proof 9000. The video took off quicker than I expected. Thousands of views overnight. Comments ranged from, "This man is a genius," to "Please sell these plans as blueprints." One fella even offered to pay me to design a similar setup for his farm in Arkansas. I told Lena to take it down just in case someone from the HOA saw it, but she said the algorithm was already doing its thing. I was officially the fence guy on TikTok. At least my face wasn't in the video. The charger, meanwhile, sat there like a confused robot. It blinked politely, showed 0 charge progress, and then reverted back to idle every time someone tried to plug in. Richie showed up a few days later, scratching his head and smelling like burnt coffee and energy drink. He poked around with a voltage meter, reset the breaker, and even replaced a fuse. Still nothing. I watched him from the porch while sipping sweet tea, waving once just to see him pretend he didn't see me. Later that afternoon, Nancy came storming up my driveway in a golf cart. The thing had a Clean Energy Warrior bumper sticker and one of those little flags that whipped in the wind like she was driving in a parade no one wanted. She didn't even wait to say hello. "We're having issues with the charger," she snapped, hopping off the cart like she was on a mission. "It's been down for days." "Oh," I said, feigning innocence. "Maybe it's solar-powered. Needs more sun." "It's not solar, Dale." "Shame. Missed opportunity." She narrowed her eyes, scanning my face like she was hoping to read a confession written in my wrinkles. "Richie thinks someone tampered with the wiring." "Well," I said, "that'd be illegal. Good thing no one would do something like that." She huffed and tried a new angle. "You're responsible for the power source, remember? We had to hook it into your barn line. Technically, it's your utility that's malfunctioning. Then technically, I said, standing up and walking toward her, you're stealing my electricity to power a device I didn't authorize on land I own. She didn't answer. Just fidgeted with her clipboard and looked off toward the charger like it might bail her out. I let the silence sit long enough to make her sweat. Lena, who'd been brushing one of the goats nearby, gave a subtle nod like she was watching a prize-fight enter round 3. I want this resolved, Dale, Nancy finally said. We're a green community. People depend on that charger. No, I said, voice calm but steady. You depend on me not knowing how my own wiring works. That's over. That night, I heard rustling by the fence. Flashlight beams danced between the posts. I stayed inside, watching through the blinds. Richie was out there with a multimeter and a cheap wire tracker, looking for a disruption. Poor guy. The subline I buried was shielded, rerouted through the attic, and split across 3 dummy grounds before feeding the fence. Even if he found a trace of it, he'd think it was just an old irrigation loop. I designed more complicated circuits in high school. This was child's play. The real cherry on top came 2 days later when I received a thick envelope from the HOA, a cease and desist letter typed in bold legalese, accusing me of sabotaging public infrastructure, violating the community's shared utility agreement, and being hostile to environmental progress. I laughed so hard, I nearly dropped my sandwich. Lena read it over my shoulder. They really used the phrase, terroristic energy redirection? What does that even mean? I think it means they're mad I outsmarted them, I said, flipping to the second page. They were demanding I restore the charger's connection or face a $1,000 fine per week. I penned my response in perfect cursive, attached copies of the land survey from 1987, the utility map showing full private ownership of the barn power, and a photo of the no trespassing sign I'd installed 3 days prior. I even included a courtesy printout of the raccoon video with a sticky note that read, "Looks like the fence is working fine. Best, Dale." The local sheriff, Tully, stopped by the next morning after getting a call from Nancy. He pulled up in his rust-colored cruiser, leaned against the doorframe, and grinned. "You really wired the fence to that charger?" "Wouldn't say that, Sheriff," I said, handing him a glass of iced tea. "I'd say the charger just ain't working the way they expected. Happens sometimes with these new gadgets." He chuckled, sipping slow. "Nancy's fuming. Says you're withholding community access." "Funny," I said. "I didn't see a single vote from the community before they drilled holes in my yard." He gave a long, slow nod. "Technically, you're in the clear. Your name's on every inch of this land, and you're not even part of the HOA. You know that?" "Yep." "They didn't." "Well, they do now." As he was leaving, Tully asked if I had a copy of the goat video too. Said his wife would love it. But Nancy wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next afternoon, while I was checking the fence voltage with Lena, we spotted something glinting by the base of the tool shed, hidden beneath some leaves. It was a trail camera, small, battery-powered, pointed directly at the side of the barn. "Oh, they're sneaky now," Lena said, picking it up. "Amateurs," I muttered. "Didn't even camouflage it right." We checked the footage. It was empty except for a few shots of the goats chewing wires and one brief clip of Richie tripping over his own cord and face-planting into a puddle. Lena uploaded that one too. So the HOA had resorted to spying. And yet, they still hadn't figured out how their charger had turned into a useless blinking statue. Meanwhile, my pasture was more secure than Fort Knox, my power bill hadn't changed, and every neighborhood dog had officially learned to steer clear of the humming fence. This wasn't just about electricity anymore. It was about principle. They came onto my land. They plugged into my life. Now, they were going to learn something I figured out years ago. If you give a man a switch, he'll flip it. But if you give him a reason, he'll rewire the whole damn grid. The week started with Richie showing up in a poncho, carrying a full spool of wire and muttering something about a backup plan. By this point, the HOA had exhausted their patience and their budget. According to the latest update from Nancy's mouth, and she only showed up now in emails, not in person, they had approved an emergency expenditure to reroute the charger's supply line directly through a new cable along the back road. Supposedly, this would bypass any sabotage-prone areas and allow the charger to draw from the HOA's main line again. That sounded real official, except the back road wasn't HOA property. It was the service easement to my south field. I knew because I mowed it every Saturday. So I sat in my rocker with a notepad and watched Richie get to work. He was trying to trench through gravel with a garden spade and a busted pickaxe, sweating like a deep fryer at a state fair. He had orange cones up and a vest on like this was a proper job site, but I knew better. Richie wasn't licensed for any of this, and the man couldn't wire a doorbell without calling his cousin for backup. He was trying to fish a live line through a PVC pipe that was already occupied by my old irrigation switchboard. I waited for the moment. Every job like this has a moment, the pause, the click, the buzz, and there it was. A spark, a yelp, and Richie stumbled backward, one arm flailing, and fell into a puddle left over from yesterday's rain. When he stood up, half his vest was singed, and he smelled like burnt carpet. Lena caught the whole thing on camera from the upstairs window and nearly dropped her phone laughing. "You think he's gonna tell Nancy he just tried to electrocute himself on a pipe he wasn't allowed to touch?" "I think he'll say it was sabotage," I replied. "That's been their favorite word lately." Sure enough, the HOA sent out a neighborhood-wide email the next morning with the subject line, "Deliberate Obstruction of Community Improvement Project." It was 4 paragraphs of finger-pointing, technical jargon copied straight from Wikipedia, and a dramatic statement about external forces interfering with clean energy deployment. The best part? They included a still image of Richie flailing in the air, claiming it showed the dangerous effects of tampered infrastructure. I nearly printed it out to frame it. Of course, their drama didn't stop there. 2 days later, a white SUV with magnetic City Infrastructure Department logos pulled up and out stepped a man in a blazer and clipboard, flanked by 2 younger guys with measuring wheels and suspiciously new boot. Nancy had called in a formal inspection, probably to prove I was illegally rerouting power or had violated some zoning code. What she didn't expect was for the inspector to be someone I knew. His name was Curtis Billings. We served in the same unit in Germany back in '85. He spotted me from the end of the driveway and lit up like Christmas. We hugged, swapped a few curse words the young guys pretended not to hear, and sat down on the porch for a beer before he even looked at the charger. Turns out, he was now contracting part-time with the city's electrical compliance office and was doing Nancy a favor. "All right, Dale," Curtis said, wiping foam off his mustache. "What kind of stupid circus have you got running here?" I gave him the whole story. The midnight charger install, the power hijacking, the fence reroute, the cease and desists, even the viral raccoon video. Curtis laughed so hard he had to take his hat off and fan himself. When we finally walked out to the charger, he poked around the panel, tested voltage, and raised an eyebrow when the readings came back flat. "Thing's a brick," he said. "No power draw, no load, no fault code. Just pretending to work." He gave the fence a side eye. "And that hum I hear? Goat deterrent." Curtis looked me over. "You run that thing off the barn?" "Let's just say I use what's mine." He gave a slow, respectful nod. "Smart. Nasty but smart. Everything checks out here. If Nancy wants to dispute it, she can hire a forensic electrician and file a zoning complaint. Good luck with that." Curtis wrote up a brief report declaring the charger non-functional due to failed HOA installation and my property not in violation of city or county code. He also made a note that any further work by Richie would require permits and a licensed supervisor. That part made me smile. I made him promise to stop by for Lena's goat yoga classes next month. He said he'd bring his wife. She loved animals and hated homeowners associations. A match made in heaven. But the real fireworks didn't start until Nancy figured out that the charger hadn't just stopped working, it had been secretly rerouted to feed my fence. She must have hired a second opinion, maybe even someone competent, because one night around 11:30, a black van rolled up without lights. Two guys in reflective vests started poking around the barn with what looked like thermal scanners. Lena and I watched from the shadows near the shed. They weren't city inspectors. They were freelancers. One of them traced a subline into the soil and got real excited, pointing toward the fence junction where my regulator box sat. That's when I flipped the hidden switch by the porch. It wasn't dangerous, just a feedback pulse enough to scare a deer. Or in this case, two grown men. A surge crackled through the wire, both guys screamed, and one of them fell backward into the mud. The van peeled out 15 seconds later without either of them saying a word. The next day, HOA inboxes were mysteriously quiet. No emails, no threats, just silence. It was the eerie kind, the kind you get before a storm. I knew Nancy wasn't done. She'd never admit she lost. No, she'd be planning something bigger. She'd already tried cameras, trenching, sabotage claims, and city inspectors. The only thing left was to double down. And that's exactly what she did. Late Friday afternoon, while I was installing a new breaker shield in the barn, Lena came running out of the house, phone in hand, her face somewhere between disbelief and hysteric. "They're doing it again," she shouted. I followed her up the hill where we could see the road, and sure enough, a new crew was laying down foundation stakes at the other end of my property. A brand new charger, double the size of the first, with a flashing sign that read, High-Speed Community Charging Hub Phase 2. They weren't just replacing the broken one, they were expanding, right into the south corner of my land. Nancy had finally snapped. And now, this wasn't just about electricity or land or goat. This was war. I stood on the hill, jaw clenched, watching a full construction crew hammer rebar into soil that didn't belong to them. The new charger wasn't just a replacement, it was a monument. A towering, stainless steel slab with twin ports, a digital payment screen, and enough wattage to light up a baseball field. Nancy had gone all in, probably emptied the HOA's emergency funds and maybe even dipped into her retirement savings, judging by the fury of her commitment. She was out there too, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a general in the middle of a siege. I counted at least 6 workers, 2 utility trucks, and a big blue porta-potty that they had the nerve to drop right behind my mulberry bushes. The smell hit me before I got halfway down the hill. Lena caught up beside me, her hair in a messy bun, holding a can of orange spray paint. "You want to mark the boundary line again?" she asked. "No," I said, eyes still locked on the chaos below. "I want to end this." She looked at me like I'd just declared martial law. "How?" "Old-fashioned way. Let them finish." The next 2 days were a spectacle. Nancy didn't sleep. Neither did I. They poured new concrete over ground that had been untouched for 40 years. Dug a trench so deep it cut through a section of old clay pipe my grandfather installed for runoff drainage. I didn't say a word. Just watched. Sheriff Tully drove by once, slowed down when he saw the mess, but didn't stop. He knew what was happening. Everyone did. Lena kept asking when I'd make my move. I told her we weren't quite at the punchline yet. It wasn't until Monday morning that the final piece fell into place. Richie was back, greasy and sunburnt, hunched over the breaker like it owed him money. This time, he came prepared. He had a voltage scanner, a secondary fuse box, and even some laminated instructions from a tech manual he clearly didn't understand. He was wiring the new charger directly into a box on the HOA's side of the street, but something was off. I could tell from his confusion that nothing was working the way it should. And it wasn't. What Nancy didn't know, and what Richie was too incompetent to catch, was that the southern field, the one they'd just invaded, sat on a utility easement that hadn't been active since 1992. It used to connect to an underground relay system that was long since retired, until I reactivated it 2 weeks ago. Not to power the fence, no. This was different. I'd rerouted the dormant lines to feed into a controlled feedback loop. Essentially, they were plugging the brand new, very expensive high-speed charger into a silent power vacuum that looped back to itself like an electrical black hole. It would flicker on, look operational, and then quietly short out every time someone tried to draw real current. No sparks. No alarms. Just disappointment. So I waited. That evening, Nancy held what she called a launch event. She passed out flyers to the neighborhood, set up a folding table with organic juice samples, and even hired a guy to play soft jazz on an electric keyboard. The whole HOA board was there, smiling, posing for photos in front of the new charger like they were unveiling a new monument in Washington. Dale, meanwhile, stayed inside the house, sipping sweet tea and watching the goats chew on a chair cushion one of the workers left behind. The real show began when the first car rolled in. A shiny new Rivian with a bumper sticker that said, "We brake for bees." The driver plugged in, checked the touchscreen, and gave a thumbs up. Everyone clapped. 2 minutes later, he frowned. The screen blinked, then went dark, then came back on and asked for a pin. Then it froze again. Nancy rushed over, trying to fix it with furious tapping. Nothing worked. The guy unplugged, tried again. Still nothing. Then came a second car. Then a third. All with the same problem. Lights blinked, the charger hummed like a dying wasp, and then flatlined. Richie tried resetting the fuse but blew it in the process. One of the workers started whispering something about faulty grounding. Another said the panel might have overheated from phantom load cycles. I nearly choked on my tea. Nancy's face turned the same shade as her rose jumpsuit. She called for Richie, who was now hiding behind the porta-potty, pretending to text. I waited until the jazz player packed up and left. That was my cue. I walked down to the site, nice and slow, like a man headed to his own courtroom. Nancy saw me coming and flinched. "You," she said through gritted teeth, "this is your doing." "Now how could it be?" I replied calmly. "I didn't install it. I didn't wire it. I didn't even authorize it. Looks like your crew just built a very expensive lawn ornament. You sabotaged the power." "You mean the HOA's power? The line you insisted on using because mine was too old-fashioned? If I recall correctly, you said your system would be fully independent." She sputtered, flipping through her clipboard like it might contain a rebuttal. "We had a permit. And that permit, as far as I can tell, doesn't override State Code 47.13c, improper use of dormant public relay systems." I checked. Her expression broke for a half-second, just long enough to show fear. "Of course," I added, "you'd only be in violation if you actually knew the lines were dormant and decided to activate them anyway, which would mean knowingly tampering with restricted infrastructure." Richie, who'd wandered too close, muttered, "Wait, they were what?" Nancy turned on him like a hawk. "You said it was safe." He stammered something unintelligible and backed away, bumping into a goat that had wandered down from the hill and was now licking one of the juice cups. Then came the final blow. Sheriff Tully pulled up in his cruiser, chewing sunflower seeds and looking bored. He walked over, scanned the charger, nodded once, and said, "Got a call from the city. They're wondering why a private organization is rerouting dormant relay lines without clearance." Nancy started to explain, but he held up a hand. "Save it. City wants an inspection. You'll need to shut this thing down until they figure out what's hot and what's not. And don't worry. I'll make sure the paperwork gets to the right folks." She didn't cry, but it was close. By the time the sun set, the charger was fenced off with caution tape, and the jazz player had already posted a TikTok with the caption, "EV launch party goes full disaster." That got more views than Lena's raccoon video. Somehow, the universe had a sense of balance. I walked back up the hill, Lena beside me, the goats trailing like backup singers. "You knew this would happen," she said. I hoped. You planned for it. Of course I did. She laughed, shaking her head. You're the pettiest old man I've ever met. No, I said, watching the charger flicker one last time, I'm just the most electrifying. The week after the charger debacle was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet, like that awkward silence after someone flips a dinner table and no one knows who should pick up the mashed potatoes. Nancy disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. No golf cart patrols, no chirpy emails about community gardening, no clipboard ambushes while you're watering the lawn. Just radio silence. The once towering high-speed charger sat behind a mess of caution tape and orange cones, humming faintly like it was embarrassed to be seen. Richie hadn't shown his face since the incident either, probably holed up in his garage trying to reset his own dignity with jumper cables. Word had spread fast, faster than the HOA newsletter ever could. The story changed depending on who told it. Some folks said the charger shorted because of lightning. Others whispered about sabotage, faulty grounding, solar ghost. One guy at the feed store claimed it was an electromagnetic curse tied to disrespecting goat. I didn't correct him. Lena, meanwhile, had started holding weekend goat yoga sessions on the upper field. She put up flyers at the co-op and posted a few polished clips online. To my surprise, people actually came. Seniors, hippies, even a couple of teenagers with piercings in places I didn't know could be pierced. They brought their own mats, stretched beside the goats, and paid in cash. A woman from 2 towns over asked if she could rent the field every Saturday for her nature therapy group. I said sure, as long as they didn't wear any HOA pins. She laughed like I was joking. One morning, while I was reinforcing the east fence line, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered. Gold trim. Glossy paper. Real dramatic. It was from Nancy herself, or, technically, from the HOA board acting on her behalf. She was resigning. Effective immediately. The letter was full of flowery language about personal reflection, community harmony, and undue stress from recent infrastructure challenges. Translation: she'd been humiliated so thoroughly, even her ego couldn't survive the fallout. The last line made me snort out loud. In light of recent events, the HOA board will be reconsidering future projects involving shared access points, public-private partnerships, and land use dispute. We encourage all residents to seek direct dialogue and cooperation moving forward. It read like a love letter to passive-aggressive failure. Lena found me chuckling on the porch and asked what was so funny. I handed her the letter, and she read it in silence, then looked up with that mischievous spark she always got when we were about to do something petty. So, do we celebrate? Depends, I said. You think the goats want to wear party hats? By the weekend, Nancy's former title had been passed off to some poor guy named Travis, who looked like he just wanted to live quietly with his succulents and not get dragged into any turf wars. I met him once, seemed harmless enough. Apologized for the charger mess and asked if the HOA could retrieve their equipment before the city issued fines. I told him I'd let them take it, but the concrete pad was staying. He asked why. I said I had plans. Those plans came to life a few days later when I installed a handmade wooden sign over the old charger pad. It read, "Dale's Off-Grid Goat Retreat, Home of Electrified Peace." I mounted a few solar lanterns on posts around it and planted wildflowers along the edge. Lena rolled her eyes at first, but even she had to admit it looked better than anything the HOA ever tried. People started pulling over to take photos. A couple from out of state asked if they could book a tour. I told them the goats didn't operate on appointments, but they were welcome to pet one if they could catch it. Then came the buyout offer. A shiny SUV pulled into my driveway one afternoon, and out stepped a man in a navy suit, far too clean for our dusty road. He introduced himself as a representative of the Meadow Falls Community Advancement Council, which was just a fancy way of saying he worked for the HOA's new strategy group. They wanted to purchase an easement on the front corner of my property. For mutual benefit, he said. Offered me $1,000, a gift basket, and some vague promise about goodwill moving forward. I laughed loudly. $1,000? I said. That wouldn't even cover my fence regulator. It's a symbolic gesture, he said, straightening his tie. It's a joke, I replied, pointing to the gate. And the punchline's that way. He left red-faced, probably realizing there wasn't a number big enough to fix what the HOA had broken. A few days later, I received a letter from the city. Not a warning this time, but a thank you. Turns out, during their inspection of the failed charger installation, they uncovered multiple permit violations and a trail of mismanaged funds going back nearly 3 years. Someone on the HOA board had been double-billing landscaping contracts and pocketing the difference. Richie's name came up a few times too. The investigation wasn't public yet, but it was coming. And when it did, I'd be ready with popcorn and lawn chairs. Lena and I celebrated with lemonade and grilled corn. She looked out across the field, now dotted with yoga mats, grazing goats, and a couple of kids trying to build a goat-sized obstacle course out of pool noodles. It was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that felt earned. You know, she said, sipping her drink, I think you scared them more with that fence than with any lawyer ever could. I didn't scare them, I said. I just reminded them who the land really belongs to. You gonna let anyone else plug into your power? Only the goats, I said. And maybe the Christmas lights. But no Teslas. She smiled. Reckon they'll try something like this again? I shook my head. Not while the fence hums. The last visitor we had that week was a local news reporter. Young guy with too much gel in his hair and a drone for aerial shot. He'd seen the TikToks, heard the rumors, and wanted to do a feature on unconventional energy independence. I told him he could film, as long as he didn't step on the mulch. He asked about the fence, the HOA, and whether I'd consider running for some kind of neighborhood office. I looked straight at the camera and said, I don't run for office. I run voltage. By the time he packed up, the sun was setting over the field, casting long shadows between the wildflowers and the old charger pad. The goats had bedded down near the barn, the fence hummed faintly in the background, and the air smelled like freedom. Some men leave legacies. I left a humming fence, a viral raccoon, and the story of the time a retired lineman turned a public EV charger into the most expensive goat deterrent in county history. Not a bad chapter to end on.